Hope everybody's having a great week. Place Your Trades Group, we just got back from the Money Show. It was fantastic. So everybody should go next year. There were a lot, actually, particularly, there were a lot of natural resource companies there, believe it or not. So it was good news for people that are into natural resources. Check out the Money Show. All right, let's start here. So good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for attending the Place Your Trades Network Spaces to discuss U.S. and Europe's energy policy. Crisis averted or crisis ahead? This Spaces is brought to you by Tradeovate, which has a custom web app dedicated to trading CME Group's new daily option contracts, including indices, energy, metals, and now Bitcoin. So you can trade these now on the DOM on Tradeovate's main platform as well. They're a great way to get exposure to the futures markets with defined risk. You can use the link in my Twitter stream to go and get the Tradeovate app for free. I also write a weekly blog on markets that you can find at placeyourtrades.com. It's absolutely free. Just click on chigrl's blog and sign up for that. And now we'll introduce our guest. So we have, yay, he's here. We have Thierry Bros. I hope I said your last name right. Dr. Thierry Bros is an expertise in energy markets, policy, climate, and geopolitics. He is a professor at Sciences Po Paris and a contributor to Natural Gas World website. In his 30-plus year-long career, Thierry was a senior policy manager and lead analyst for oil and gas organization, vice president research of a U.S. LNG company, senior European gas and LNG analyst, as well as a senior financial equity analyst. Previously, he was in charge of security supply at the French Ministry of Economy and Finance, where he liberalized the French gas market and supervised the European Contingency Gas Plan. On the academic side, Thierry has been a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And in his first book, published in 2012, he rightly forecasted that the surge in U.S. oil and gas production was going to deeply alter the energy and geopolitical landscapes. Next, we have Ralph Schoenenemer. Ralph is an assistant professor of international relations at Webster Vienna Private University, where he teaches economics and political science. Besides his academic work, he regularly contributes on national and international broadcasters, including Sky News Australia, The Hill TV. He also writes commentary on political and economic issues in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Unheard, Spiked, the Jerusalem Post, the Washington Examiner, and the American Spectator. And last but not least, we have my good friend, DavidRamsdenWoo. David was the co-founder and COO of One Energy Partners, which was sold in 2018. He began his career in energy as a reservoir engineer for Anadarko in 2001. Throughout his career, he has held roles across the analytical spectrum, including completion and production engineering and business development. One of David's key skill sets is his ability to analyze the flow of funds throughout the opportunity set and to interpret market trends, which has led to the founding and co-founding of multiple oil and gas teams and entities. He has an engineering degree from University of Calgary and an MBA from Cornell, and he is now an advocate of sound energy policy and an investor. So everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for taking time out of your day. And with that, let's get right to it. So we'll start with Thierry. So, well, first, everybody wants to know about natural gas in Europe, obviously. So McKinsey just came out with a report that said Europe could be at substantial risk if it fails to immediately reduce gas demand by 55 billion cubic meters. And the research also found that the total cessation of Russian imports could reduce Europe's energy supply by 25 BCM, and renewed Asian LNG demand could soak up 35 of supply, while colder winter in 2023 could push up demand by 15 BCM. So now that EU energy prices are down 85% off of July 2022 highs, many seem to think this crisis is over. So I'd like to can you walk us through this and give us your thoughts on this? And also, you posted a chart of EU gas storage not filling as quickly as the average. So I'm going to put that in the nest while you're talking.
Yes. Thank you very much. So a few things. First of all, we managed to get through last winter, and we managed to reduce our gas demand by 13%, 1.3. But if you look at how this was reduced, you can say that half of it came from demand destruction on the industrial side, 35% came from a warm winter, and 15%, the last, came from consumers' behavior changes. And so now we have to think about next winter. And if you think of it, and we've seen this in the past, demand destruction, industrial demand destruction is permanent and part will come back. As you rightly stated, prices are now 85% lower than when they were last year. So what you can expect is half of this demand destruction from the industrial side will come back. I mean, we've seen some glass industry in France reopening. We are still seeing the fertilizer industry reopening, etc., etc. So I think there is a complacency on the political side to say, well, we've done minus 13%, we can do even better next year. It's going to be way, way, way more difficult. And I think the trend is going to revert, i.e. we are going to see an increase in 2023 versus 2022. So I think that's the first element. Everybody thinks that demand is still going down. I think demand is now picking up versus year on year. So I think that's the first element. Second element, as you rightly stated, I'm worried about the storage. Storage have been extremely high because we've managed to fill our storage and to go through this energy sobriety, as I would say, in the last winter. So we've ended last withdrawal period in March, mid-March, with record level, 58% full. But since then, it hasn't moved up. Normally, once you've moved from a withdrawal to an injection period, you restart to refill your storage quite fast. And in fact, what we are now back in the historical range. So the 5 years in historical range. So we are at record level still, but not above. And people can say, well, it's because it's cold right now. But you could also say, well, it's because there is this demand picking up from the industry. And this is why I think storage is a better indicator. Remember, in Europe, we don't have so much data very, very fast in terms of supply and demand. So I think that's the demand side equation. If I look on the supply, what we have today is something like 2 BCM per month of Russian pipe gas, half of it going through Ukraine and half of it going through Turkey. This could go down. I don't think it can, but this could go down. And remember, we have to believe and we have to be prepared to any kind of changes from the Kremlin. So it can go down, could go up. I think it can go down, but I don't think they will close it down permanently. But I mean, 24 BCM per year is 24 BCM per year, is something like 5% of our annual demand. So 5% is still met by Russian pipe gas, which is a little dirty secret because nobody wants to say who is buying this gas. But utilities in Europe, some utilities in Europe are buying. Plus another 5% comes from Russian LNG. So, and this is all at risk. Plus, as you rightly stated, there is not much more LNG coming. I mean, the Freeport is coming on the US side, but there may be the Chinese that will want more LNG going forward. So my guess is we've managed to go through winter last year because of a warm winter. And I think that's important to keep in mind. On a probability basis, it's going to be a big bet to bet again on a warm winter in 2023. And so therefore, we have to be better prepared. And I think we are complacent here. And maybe the crisis could hurt again in a few months' time.
And then just to expand on that, also, McKinsey was also saying that 57% of EU manufacturers would not be able to further reduce their gas consumption while maintaining output over the next 2 years. And this indicating that further gas rationing measures could substantially impact the EU economy. And we've already seen, and this started in fall of 2021, we've already seen smelters have to shut down. Anybody that's using, that was using a blast furnace, obviously a natural gas blast furnace that takes a lot of energy. So we saw a lot of smelters go down in France. We saw some glass manufacturers go down. What are your thoughts on this with regards to, do you think this manufacturing is going to come back, and how sustainable is this path, and how much manufacturing and industrial production is likely gone forever? I know that's kind of a three-part question.
Yeah, no, I think when I've looked at the crisis back in 2005 in the UK, when there was extreme high prices also, we've seen this in the industrial demand destruction. And my rule of thumb here is half of it is permanently destroyed, so it's not going to come back. I mean, industries just decided to close down, and they may relocate in other places in the world where the energy is cheaper, and it may, by the way, be the US. And think of it by the US having price of gas today in the US is 6 times less than in Europe. The laws are as good as in Europe, and you have the Inflation Reduction Act that could help people to relocate in the US. So I believe that half of it is permanently lost, but the other half should rebound. And so hopefully, we will have this rebound. As you stated, we are seeing some of the furnace restarting. And so this means that gas demand will be higher on the industrial side in 2023 versus 2022, which is not what the policy are thinking. I remind you that the European Commission decided on the 30th of March of this year to extend the directive that the very good directive they had designed in August last year to push member states to reduce gas demand by 15%, to extend it further. But again, first of all, we haven't done 15%. We had only done 13 for the full year. And again, it's more difficult to further reduce demand than to reduce the first few BCM. So this is where I think we are a bit complacent in Europe vis-a-vis the gas demand going forward. And please remember that the Kremlin is waging 2 wars, one in Ukraine, which is a military war, but one in Europe, against Europe, where it's a hybrid war. And so the Kremlin could use any kind of tool, and has used energy, and could further use energy.
With regards to that, do you think that the energy policies EU has put forth with regards to Russia has hurt them or helped them overall? And what are some of those hurdles? I'm trying to ask this without you having to give an opinion.
I think we were too dependent on gas. I mean, we were 40% dependent on Russian-side gas. And you know that when you are too dependent, dependency works both sides, but also it is hurting us. And so if you look at what the EU has done, the EU has done what it could, which is to put an embargo on coal. This was the first thing, and I had written a note just a few weeks after the beginning of the war, saying exactly this. The EU should start with an embargo on coal, on Russian coal. It has been done. The EU then implemented an embargo on Russian oil and then Russian oil products with some kind of ceiling on Russian oil, which might not work very well, but that's another G7 story. And on the gas, we haven't, because we can't. Because, again, the Russian pipe gas is accounting for 5% of our annual demand as we speak right now. And if you add the Russian LNG, it is 10% of our annual demand as we speak. And those are going to be the most difficult to get rid of. And if we want to get rid of, by the way, we need to find alternative suppliers, which, by the way, we haven't yet. So I think it's also a question of how do we deal with this in the short, medium, and also long term.
Which leads me to one more question, or not the only question, but one more question is, being that the EU doesn't really want to sign long-term LNG contracts and is kind of thereby forced to go onto the spot market, which is more expensive and also competing with Asia, how is this going to, affect them? I mean, obviously, it's going to be very costly. Is that the right approach?
No, I think it's not the right approach. I mean, I've been saying for quite a few years that this EU Commission is energy illiterate. And I think they are still in this mood because they believe that they overcome last winter. And so therefore, they're very proud of themselves, not understanding that the outcome of this was because of a warm winter and because of industrial demand destruction. And unfortunately, I have to say that unless we face hardship, i.e. some kind of difficult stuff, be it in the gas or in the electricity sector, then the EU Commission will stay with this mindset. Because last winter was warm, the story in Brussels is still the same. Don't sign long-term contracts, everything will be fine. We are going to play again with the Russian roulette this winter. Maybe we are going to lose. I mean, the Russian roulette, remember, every time you play, the probability of losing gets higher.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, we will come back to you. I'm going to move over to Ralph. So let's ask this. So how does the EU ensure security of energy supply? And what are they doing that's not working? And what should they be doing? That's kind of a big question, I know.
No, but it's a good one, and thank you, Ferry, for your remarks. It's almost hard to come after you because I think you outlined perfectly the key points. I would add one thing, Tracy, that you already alluded to. We have to distinguish between the question of the physical availability of energy, be it gas, coal, or oil, and the price. I mean, we saw this last year. It's correct that Europe was lucky with the winter, but we still paid a lot of money for the energy that we bought up on the international market. Germany alone, it's the famous $440 billion that they used. Europe altogether was about 1.2 trillion. And I think if you allow me to connect it to politics, it creates another problem because, of course, as Tracy, as you pointed out, a lot of it get bought on the spot market at high prices. It is then stored and everybody celebrates that the storage is full. But of course, this means that prices in the market tend to fall. But it was still bought at a very high price. So utility companies are reluctant to pass on lower prices to customers, but at the same time, populist politicians say, well, look at the prices, the Henry Hub, look at the international prices, gas prices are so low, why can't they pass it on to consumers? Well, because they paid more when they had to buy it. And I think then you will have pressure on these utility companies to lower prices, but they don't have the money. Then we saw this in Germany with some companies, then they're under pressure, then they have to be nationalized. If they're nationalized, then political decisions will have a huge influence on where the energy actually goes, and that being the most efficient way of doing it is unlikely because they will not put the energy where it is needed most. They will put the energy where they think they have the highest political profit. So I think there is then this element as well. The other thing is, and I think again, Thierry pointed towards this quite nicely. He said it very politely. I would be more harsh in this. I think, yes, there is particularly within the European Commission, I'm very worried that they really do not know how commodity and energy markets function. I think that they honestly do believe that we are on the brink of freeing ourselves entirely from fossil fuels and going into alternatives. And that's why they refuse to make these long-term contracts. And I think that's a very, very worrisome development. Now, what should they do? it's a difficult question. My answer is always the same. It's an unpopular one, but I believe that they should look into ways to explore and start finding energy or finding ways of exploring and using energy sources that are available within Europe, whether it's gas in Groningen. Yeah, I know there are some environmental issues, but I think they're manageable. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room, which is the re-entry or continuation of nuclear power. I mean, we have not just Germany, we have also Belgium. We are in a situation where fully functional nuclear power plants have been turned off. And I think this is something that one is also look at. And again, Thierry kind of pointed this out. Germany is, as we speak, and so do other European countries, they're still planning to use gas for electricity production. And electricity production, at least hypothetically, would be something that could be replaced either with nuclear or with an expedited, even though I'm not a fan of it, an expedited build out of renewable energy. But renewable energy is moving very, very slowly. We have environmental groups who are mobilizing against it. We have supply chain issues, especially in the wind area, and hydro energy is a similar problem. There's a huge resistance both against pumping storage and against building additional hydropower, what the topography would actually allow it. So on the one hand, everybody is afraid of an energy shortage, but at the same point, everybody is or not everybody, but there's significant resistance against building new energy. And one last point, just maybe we can talk about this in greater detail a little bit later, but this is a topic that I feel is so underappreciated. We need to talk more about the grid. I think this is really a huge issue, and in Europe, it sometimes reminds me the bigger picture about European energy policy, and it's a metaphor. It's not perfect, but allow me to try to make it. It's a little bit, imagine you look at a country's railway net and you say, you know what, we would like to build brand new train stations, wonderfully looking, environmentally conscious railway stations. And then you make all these plans, you start building all these train stations, and then you start realizing that you forgot to connect those train stations to the railways. And that's a little bit the relationship between renewable energy and the grid in Europe. Like, we cannot get very often the plant and actual energy to where it is needed. So it looks good to say offshore wind in the North Sea or in the North Sea can replace a power plant in Bavaria. Now, that is true in production, but you need to get that electricity from the North Sea to Bavaria, where that power plant no longer exists. And that is very tricky because in many ways those transition lines either have not yet been built or are not capable at this point to transport the energy. So I think there's a huge infrastructure problem, and but politicians, they focus on bits and pieces and ignore the bigger picture. And this is also something that I'm worried about.
That was actually my next question to you. The next question was, EU is pretty intertwined energy-wise. Can the electrical grids even handle 2030, 2050 goals, which is obviously no. And what is being done to address this? Is there anything in the EU new energy policy? Their answer to the US's IRA. Is there anything being done to address in that particular piece of legislation? And also, in that piece of legislation, that policy calls for 10% of renewable minerals to be mined in the EU. So how realistic is this with all the permitting red tape?
Well, I think it's highly unrealistic for a couple of reasons. One is there has been huge excitement about, for example, rare earth findings in Sweden and in Spain. But as all of you know, even under let's assume the best possible conditions, if they would be put in place, really streamlining permitting processes and everything to really get such a mine online, it takes 10 years. And that's a very, very optimistic estimate, I would say. Usually it takes significantly longer. The second part is, There's this irony, and I think Thierry already mentioned this about demand going up. Just to put an anecdote to this, I think that highlights this a little bit. So Lufthansa, the German airline, for those of you who don't know, in Spain, there is something that is best described as an airplane graveyard. Like, it's a huge free area in the Spanish desert, and there are all these huge A380 Airbus, those mega flyers, the mega planes that the build are standing around. And Lufthansa is now bringing them back because the orders they have with Boeing, they cannot produce fast enough, but demand for flying is growing faster than they anticipated. So I would say that of course, then also has maybe not a significant, but it has upward pressure on resource demand. And the same, I think, is true with the question of mining. If I look at the document by the EU, I think they underestimate the intensity of energy in the mining sector. I don't want to say something wrong, but I think it's the mining industry is, when it comes to industrial energy use, it's the largest or the second largest industry there is. So all these very, very ambitious goals, I don't think that they are pars or that they're on a level with the energy reality in Europe. And unfortunately, we have a habit within the EU. We saw this in the 90s with common defense, and we see it now with energy, that they are very good in writing these documents and making these plans and setting those goals, but they almost never accomplish them. Just to give you one quick example, in 1995, the decision was made that Europe needs its own independent military force, its rapid reaction force. That never materialized. That never happened. And I'm afraid that the Green Industry Act and the Fit for 55 and all these other ideas that have now been formulated will have a similar rendezvous with reality at some point.
So, do you have any contingency plans in case these green energy policies do not come to fruition as they planned?
Yes, coal. That's I would say that's the contingency plan. German lignite in many ways is this was the ironic, if you want, relationship between France and Germany at the moment. So if French nuclear is having a hard time, and the last summer was problematic for multiple reasons, I have to admit. So the French, somewhat unjustifiably, their nuclear power gets a bad rap. So 2022 they had a very unfortunate year. But when Germany had a lack of electricity, French nuclear helped them out, and when the French had a problem, German coal helped them out. So I think this is going to be a continuous relationship in the future. But the position of the coal industry in Germany is definitely going to be strengthened, because even in the current documents, Germany is still planning to use gas-powered plants as their bridging technology. So they're still expecting to build out their gas-powered electricity production. It goes back to what Thierry said, I think perfectly. All the indicators seem as if there will be a growing demand for gas and not a shrinking one. Unless, of course, and this is something we have discussed also, you can always reduce demand, right? Through demand destruction and the closing down of industry. But that's going to have a huge economic and social cost. And yeah, I pretty much I agree with everything that Thierry said before.
All right, thank you, Ralph. We're going to move over to the U.S. We're going to talk to David for a little bit, and we'll get back to Ralph and Thierry. But let's talk about the U.S. a little bit. So, do you think the U.S. is on the same path as Europe? Particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to follow them down this unrealistic path? We have the same problems with, say, mining for minerals that they do in Europe. We have huge permitting problems.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So it's been great to listen to Ralph and Thierry before me. I'm not usually the least well versed in the data in the normal group, so I'm going to try and go a little bit less data centric and a little bit more just sort of discussion centric. And so yeah, is the U.S. headed down that policy? Yes, for two reasons. Number one, we're just doubling down on wind and solar, and the conversation, the dirty boogeyman that knows when it's not windy.
Oh, you're cutting out. You're cutting out a little bit
here. Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can reposition. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So I was just saying, we're heading down this path that we're relying on energy that requires the wind to be blowing in the place that you need energy and the sun to be shining. And so, are we headed down the same path as Europe? Absolutely. When we're destabilizing the grid by reducing the storables, i.e. coal, i.e. natural gas, and we're relying on the intermittents, of course we're headed down that path. And it doesn't take much to compare Germany and California in terms of the cost of the policies. Germany's electricity price is at least 50% higher than the rest of Europe, which then in turn is higher than the United States. So you lose businesses, you lose manufacturing, you lose everything on the path that we're going down. And then the biggest one is that at the end of the day, if the objective is to reduce CO2, one must talk about the fact that China has more CO2 emissions than Europe and the United States combined, and that in practice, China's net zero policy is they give net zero Fs about CO2. And so we're spending trillions of dollars a year, 400 billion, 350 billion, I think, in the IRA to subsidize wind and solar and renewables. And China is building coal-fired plants all over. And so, this is like a swimming pool. There's no such thing as a no peeing section in a pool. And as long as China continues to expand its emissions and expand the use of coal, we're barking up the wrong tree, and it's going to be more costly to consumers in the US, more costly to consumers in Europe, and at the end of the day, China will win the energy war. So yes, we are headed the exact same place.
And let's go to the Inflation Reduction Act a little bit. So obviously, that plan is very ambitious for wants to electrify everything. Obviously, we have an aging grid that can't handle that. I mean, it's same with the EU. So how does this problem resolve itself? Does it not? And what are some other problems with this bill? And then I had another question, but answer that first.
I mean, so yes, and it was actually funny. I'm in Dallas to give a speech today, and I was in a cab being driven by a Somali driver, and we were talking about the challenges of energy. And the fact is, in the United States, there are 280 million vehicles on the road, of which roughly 1% are electric. And so, sure, you want to electrify everything. You want to get rid of natural gas stoves in people's houses because it's apparently a health danger, even though we've been doing fine for the last 50 years. But how are you going to move 20 million barrels a day of oil consumption that's 70% used for transportation? That electricity has to be generated by a grid that's increasingly unstable, and as we've shut down coal plants, is more and more reliant on intermittence. And so it takes, like, for example, we saw last week in Germany the reduction of those last 3 nuclear plants when nuclear was only generating 6% of German electricity, led to, in one way, shape, or form, a 45% increase in electricity prices starting June 1st. And so 6% of electricity, if we needed to generate more, not the replacement of 14 million barrels a day of oil, but like we would have to generate substantially more electricity. And where's it coming from? It has to be coming from fossil fuels, and it becomes extremely dear. And I love the comment that Ralph made. Yeah, it's all well and good that Europe got through the winter with storage and was able to access natural gas, and wow, we did so well. But as you said, $1.2 trillion was spent, and that was just in a warm winter. So we're dealing with very inelastic supply. And the U.S. in certain parts, Minnesota comes to mind, North Dakota comes to mind, New York, Chicago come to mind. I mean, these have very, very cold winters, and when it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit, people are going to heat their house. That becomes extraordinarily expensive. So it's just too ambitious a plan, right? Even the electric vehicles, hybrids make more sense, but we don't talk about hybrids. We talk about full EVs, Teslas, etc. And those are luxury items. They don't work in everyday life, in my opinion.
And do you think nuclear could be an answer? And do you see the U.S. fully pursuing that? I mean, we are kind of talking about smaller nuclear reactors. Do you think the administration is kind of serious about that? And do you think that we'll see kind of a growth market in that area?
We should, yes, because I think that despite Vogel and the cost implications of building, I think it's 2,000 megawatts of power, and it's going to cost $32 billion. So by any measure, that's extraordinarily expensive. But to do that over and over and over, and as we decommission, for example, coal plants in Wyoming that already have transmission lines pre-built, to be able to do something with nuclear in those areas, it makes a lot of sense. So if we are serious about decarbonization, if we are serious about having a base load that then can manage around the variability of wind and solar, nuclear has to be a part of the solution, unquestionably. And in the transition timeframe, natural gas is, and coal, quite frankly, is the best fuel to be able to allow for Americans, Europeans, etc., to maintain their standards of living. So, what method does that go through? I mean, I hate to say it has to be the government, because the government did so well on COVID. I don't really trust them with the next $6 trillion they spend. But had they spent the amount of money they did in PPP and COVID relief on advancing nuclear technologies and quite frankly, building with existing technologies, the U.S. would be in a much, much more stable, better place. And at some point, we need to have rational energy conversation in Washington that makes nuclear a much larger part of the solution if decarbonization is the goal. And clearly, that's the stated goal.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to go back to theory really quick. We're going to have one more round of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I know Peter has a question, so but I want to get through the next round of questions first, and then we'll take audience questions. But so back to theory. I had a question. The EU just passed this carbon border tax. Can you explain exactly what this is and what does it mean for the EU?
Yes, but perhaps a follow-up comment on what has just been said. I mean, if we were in Europe to do exactly like the UK has done in terms of coal to gas switching, i.e. move away from the coal and burn more gas in the time that we need to build new nukes, and again, new nukes, some countries will take them like France, and it will be 2035, then overnight we will reduce our emission by nearly 40% in power generation. And I think we are very far away from this. So this is the added element I wanted to say. On the EU ETS, where the EU has launched the trading of CO2 back in 2005, so it's not new. I used to be a civil servant when we were doing this. The idea was, let's price this pollution and people will try to find solution. And we've done this for the last 15, 16, 17, 18 years. And unfortunately, it hasn't been a great success because prices of the CO2 were very low. Until 2018, they were below 10 euros per ton. And so there was no major incentive for industries to change. It changed very recently between 2018 and today. Price of CO2 was multiplied by 10. So this is one of the best performing commodities, if I may say so. And so we had we were trying to reduce our CO2 emission. But again, please keep in mind the best in class at the EU level was the UK that left us because the UK had imposed an extra tax on CO2. So the idea from there is say, well, let's do what's good at. So let's price the CO2 at a high level, and 100 euro per ton is a level that allows its coal to gas switch in the power sector, but could allow also for carbon capture and sequestration. And the second element was the little dirty secret of Europe. I mean, Europe is showing that to the rest of the world that we are doing this trading of CO2, except that half of the permits are given for free to industries. The refining industry gets 80% of the permit for free. The steel industry gets 110% of the permit for free, etc., etc. And this is for some kind of element that we call carbon leakage. So we are worried that if they had to pay, then they will move away. So what we've done this time is we are going to try to claw back those free allowances, which is going to be very, very difficult. I mean, think about you receiving permits for free and tomorrow having to pay 100 euro per ton, I mean, your lobbyist will fight extremely hard in Brussels. And to try to avoid the full disindustrialization of Europe, to put a carbon tax. I mean, we don't call it tax because otherwise it wouldn't be allowed in Europe, but a carbon border mechanism at the border of Europe. The problem here are twofold. First of all, I mean, the US didn't like it and came with the Inflation Reduction Act. I believe the Inflation Reduction Act is in the US is the US answer to the European Commission. So you want to use sticks, we are going to use carrots on the US side. And China doesn't like it, and China may go to the WTO and question this. So, I mean, everything is nice on the paper, as it was said before, but in practice, it's way different than theory. And theory is extremely nice. So we have the whole theory done. We know how to regulate the whole thing perfectly well, except that if China doesn't want to play exactly the role that we expect China to do, and if they question the whole thing at the WTO, this might not be implemented as it is. Plus, I mean, keep in mind, we're only doing this for 6 industrial sectors. So I think we are, I mean, I can understand the narrative, the policy narrative behind, but we are very far from achieving something. And at the end of the day, I think the question of the carrot and the stick could be the right one. I mean, is this with carrots that the US will manage the decarbonization or the hydrogen of the economy, or is it with the EU stick that the EU will manage? And I think the jury is still out, and I would be very, very cautious on both sides.
Thank you. And then I also wanted to kind of go into, so the EU just launched joint gas purchases for like 80 companies. What does this mean for the EU? What does it mean for those companies? And what are the advantages or disadvantages of this new plan?
Well, I mean, the Soviet regime died a few decades ago, but we have Soviet 2.0 in Brussels. So we are now going to have some kind of a joint purchase mechanism that never worked. And so I mean, the European Commission is extremely proud of having put this in place. We will see. I mean, now it's compulsory for states to put some percentage of their storage into the joint purchase mechanism. But I'm not so sure that sellers will be very happy to go through a platform where you're not very sure or secure about how the commercial data sensitivity is provided. Plus, it's also a question about the competition rules. I mean, we are based the US, the European Union, democracy on capitalism and competition. I mean, this is competition that's for the good of consumers. If you put some civil servants buying you gas, buying you bread, buying you whatever, I'm not so sure it's going to turn up very well. I used to be a civil servant, so the concept, I can understand it. What I'm a bit worried is, as I know the commodity market and as I know Brussels doesn't understand the commodity market, it may turn out to be a complete disaster. But we shall see, and this is why also I am a bit worried about the storage refilling, because if people believe that the joint purchase mechanism will provide those 10% of storage that is needed, and at the end of the day, it doesn't turn out to be ready, or sellers are not willing, then we will be short in terms of storage. So I think I prefer tough regulation, i.e. to say to the industry, you have to fill storage to 90%, which I think is what we have, versus you have to fill storage up to 90%, but we are offering you some kind of mechanism where you could go through and perhaps get 10% of those 90%. I mean, the regulation needs to be clear and easily understandable. If it isn't, then lawyers will allow companies to go around it.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And the more you try to regulate this industry in particular, the worse off it seems to leave it. We'll go to Ralph next for another couple of questions. So, what are the EU's priorities for research and innovation in the sector? And how does it or does it not support the development of new technologies and business models? In other words, are they just pursuing wind and solar, or are there other things that they're pursuing and throwing money at research, or is it just depending on, we just want wind and solar and no fossil fuels?
Well, allow me to make a couple of points that I think fit nicely into what was said before. I mean, number one is there is the impression that the European Union tries to fight the laws of economics and the laws of physics with regulation. I mean, to give you just one example, you mentioned this. Imagine a hypothetic EV producer in Europe. As we all know, electric vehicles need a lot of aluminum. And now you have the situation due to the energy policies of the European Union, aluminum production is very expensive in Europe. So that's going to be a huge factor when it comes to the cost. So maybe the company says, all right, European produced aluminum is too expensive. I'm going to buy it outside of the European Union. But you can't do this either, because when you want to import the cheaper produced aluminum, they're going to put a special carbon tax on it. And so you end up in the situation where wherever you turn, production in Europe is getting more expensive. We have a massive supply side problem in Europe. It's also driving inflation in certain areas. And all the policies that are being made at the moment look to me as if they're not addressing that supply side problem. Now, one argument is, as you guys correctly pointed out, it's about CO2 reductions. Allow me to say something heretic, if I may. The world is rolling the dice on climate change. India, China, some other nations, they have pretty much said they will not reduce their CO2 emissions in the amount necessary. If we look at the US, that was mainly the switching from coal to gas. Emissions have been going down. They have also been going down in Europe. Economic growth has been decoupled from CO2. So I think that overall these emissions would go down anyways. The problem is the velocity with which politics demands it to happen. And this velocity can only be reached in many ways, I would argue, by industry destruction. Or the alternative would have been by switching from coal to nuclear, but we all know what the nuclear situation is in Europe. Now, to Tracy's question about research, I think if you don't have manufacturing, if you don't have industry, research will start to disappear as well, because a lot of the things we learn very often as a side product from applying it. And VW, for example, right, the big German car manufacturer, has now is planning to spend $1 billion on an innovation center in China, because they also say they want the innovation where their production is. And I think this is really the big thing here. No matter how we turn this, industry in Europe is under significant pressure. The answer by politics is regulation, and the idea that you can have then special subsidies and special funds. But in the end, what you do then is you create a very tight relationship between some companies and politics, which I would argue is, again, choking off potential innovation. So that's another point that's also a problem in the US. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, but as we see now with Joe Manchin from West Virginia, the senator from West Virginia, the Inflation Reduction Act had some provisions also for expanding of fossil fuels, but apparently the Biden administration is not willing to execute those. Then something, Tracy, you have written and posted a lot about this. The finance industry in some areas seems still to be bound towards defunding in many ways. That might be an exaggeration, but let me say it this way for dramatic effect, on defunding fossil fuel industries, and the industry is also underinvested. So I'm sure that on the long run, these problems are solvable. But at the moment, I think we are kind of moving more and more into an area of a reliable energy shortage. And a last point, just to emphasize this, I know that everybody who's a part of this conversation is listening knows this, but I think it's still so important to say this. The energy sector is not just a sector, right? It is the sector that makes all the other sectors possible. We do not know of an industrialized nation that remains competitive if they have an artificially created shortage of energy. And I think this is what the Chinese know. The Chinese build out everything That's the difference. And I looked at the numbers. The megawatt hour in China is about half, the price for it is half of what it is in Germany. So honestly, if I would be a German company, I would also go to China. I mean, these are massive, massive price differences. And the European idea to say, well, then we make special subsidies, or in Germany, they call it an industry energy price. Well, but you still have to pay for it. So once again, you're going to make the population poorer after you made energy scarcer, and then you try to keep the industry here. But at some point, you're also going to have a customer problem. If your population gets poorer, to whom are they going to sell all those things? Well, the European answer is we make then subsidies again so that people can buy those things. But this seems to me then to be potentially a long-run inflationary spiral that is really, really bad. We have, last point, please let me make this real quick. We have a bureaucracy and regulation problem and a competency problem in the area of politics and regulation. I could not agree more with Thierry. He says it again very politely, but we really have a problem with the competency in the energy and commodity area. And if they don't step up their game, I think the trend, the overall trend will remain a negative one.
Absolutely, and probably for a while, right? I mean, this is not solvable in 5-10 years, I don't think.
Yeah, and if you allow me a last point, the German minister, one of those responsible for the closing down of the nuclear power plants, was either this morning or yesterday, published a piece with Project Syndicate, which is a fairly well-reputed publication, and what they're saying is blatantly wrong, right? Again, Thierry and also David mentioned it before. We see what's happening with the prices. We know that the megawatt hours, the gigawatt hours that are being lost, we know that this is going to have an impact. We have some very good calculations that Germany is going to move from being an an electricity exporter to being an electricity importer. Germany will have a law by January 1st, 2024, that 65% of all heating must come from renewables. So this will also drive up the necessity for electricity. And politicians, either they don't know it, then they should remain silent on it, or they know it and say the untruth, which is it's an even worse. So I don't know if it's dishonesty or incompetence, but it is very, very worrisome. And I mean, I wish the Europeans and since I'm in Vienna myself, all the best of luck. I really hope we save the global climate, because otherwise we sacrificed our wealth and our industries for nothing. And I'm sure that some of you have seen the headline from a member of the Bank of England today. He said it about England, but I think it's true for all of Europe, that we simply have to accept that we are poorer. Well, that's easy for somebody to say who makes $100,000 dollars or euros a year. But if you are a member of the working class, this will have political repercussions. I mean, we see it in France. So this is going to have consequences. And I think the political class is completely oblivious to this. But that's just a side note.
No, that's a really good, it's a very good note. And I think that's a good topic for another spaces. Absolutely. What are the social and political implications of what's going on right now? So you just gave me my next spaces idea. Thank you. And going to David, I kind of wanted to talk about U.S. nat gas for a little bit here, because everybody's trying to catch a bottom. Everyone's saying, are we going to see a reversal? So first of all, kind of how much export capacity is being built out? Do we have enough long-term contracts for this? And, I don't, everybody thinks just because gas prices go up necessarily means that the U.S. does, but that's not necessarily true. So can you kind of just talk about the U.S. nat gas industry, kind of where we're at as far as, again, capacity and if we even have enough long-term contracts for all this? Hello, are you cutting out again?
I might be cutting out. Can you hear me?
Where do you live? In the middle of nowhere? Well, okay, I can hear you now.
I'm downtown Dallas. I know I'm in downtown Dallas, but I can't comment on the specifics to the exports. But obviously, the market is stranded here, and Freeport has had a huge impact on our ability to export gas. And I do find it, just as a material comment, the fact that 6 months ago, going into Europe winter, traders were willing to buy gas at $9 an MCF, and now we're trading at $2. Fundamentally, as gas companies have known from 2012 to 2022, when natural gas prices are $2 an MCF, you lose the ability to make a reasonable rate of return. And so I would say the biggest problem right now is you have all these companies that are producing gas at less than their actual costs. So do we have enough supply? Yes, of course we have enough supply, but natural gas prices need to be more like $4 an MCF as opposed to $2 an MCF. And it's impossible to be a gas bull, because the second that we have some event globally that makes us think that natural gas prices are going to firm up and allow us to be reasonable, it gets crushed. So I have not been a natural gas bull for 10 years for that reason. I had a moment of optimism during August, but it was based on, as we've been talking about, the crisis in Europe and the fact that you just simply did not have enough energy there to be able to heat homes. And now we're sort of back to stabilization, and we'll head to next winter. And the Russian roulette example is perfect. At some point, it will be cold, and we will have a natural gas issue. We won't be able to get the natural gas there. And I want to speak, because it hasn't come up on this talk yet, the Nord Stream pipeline. Does anyone find it fascinating that somehow we've never resolved who did it, and that the Russians themselves have access to this thing called a valve? And so should they want to shut off natural gas into Europe, and as we talked about, 40% of Germany's natural gas came from Russia. So like, if you want to punish them, you close the valve. And Seymour Hersh had a Substack that came out probably 2 months ago that pointed to a whole bunch of sources and said what most of us should suspect is that it was either a U.S. or a sanctioned U.S. operation to impact Europe's access to natural gas, whether it's to extend the proxy war, whether it's to hurt Europe and move industry to the United States because it's too expensive. But when you have that political of an event that A, the world has never really got a great answer for, and B, it has to be suspected that it was U.S. sanctioned, and Seymour Hersh's article would certainly suggest that it was. What are the geopolitical implications on the commodity of natural gas when we ourselves are weaponizing it? Forget what Russia's doing. Like, we are weaponizing it by destroying infrastructure. So I think that has yet to play out, and it will be very interesting to see.
Indeed, it will. And it looks like Piotr's been patiently waiting, had a question. So we'll take questions, a couple questions from the audience before we wrap it up.
Yeah,
Piotr?
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, I mean, wide-ranging and very insightful, a lot of food for thought. I would just point out on Seymour Hersh that he's also made incorrect claims about Russia and the war. So his insinuations about the pipeline might be, I agree with you very much. It's incredibly difficult to tell who might have done it and in what capacity. But as my father, who works heavily in mining commodities in this industry, said, who benefits outrightly? It's the United States, because they've overtaken Russia as the outright provider of LNG now. So that's one thing. But coming to my question, I was in Ukraine a few months back as part of a World Bank report. We were doing some investigation or whatever, field work into the role of decarbonisation as part of a post-war reconstruction process. And one of the things that I was learning from listening to Ukrainians around different parts of the country was that there is a genuine, variance of opinion about the shift in, if you want to be a net zero carbon economy once you reconstruct it, right? So I was just wondering for people's thoughts on, number one, this rapidity and emphasis on zero carbon and the ESG principles, which I think is got a bit of a backlash. But second, also just, where do we actually get the alternative forms of specifically like LNG, right? So Azerbaijan has been touted as one, but they've announced only a slight rise in deliverables. Generally, what I understand is the EU is going to face a difficulty in actually trying to purchase LNG this year because of a growing interest from China and generally sort of reaching near capacity. So just wondering, what alternative sources do we have? North Africa, Qatar. Just curious what people's thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Anybody want to take that? It's up for grabs, since he didn't name anybody specifically.
I can start if you want. On the net zero, I think it's a narrative. It's a political narrative, and they won't be there, the political leaders that are pushing this narrative, and so they don't really care. I've always stated that if we are really willing to do something for climate, people in position should be liable for the emissions their country is doing during their mandate, i.e. if your emissions are going up, you should resign. And if you use this metric, the European Commission should have resigned already 3 times, being there for 3 years. So I think I wouldn't put too much about Ukraine and the reconstruction being completely net zero. I think on the Ukraine reconstruction, the main question for me is who's going to pay? Because again, we are hearing the Commission saying Russia should pay. Well, Russia might not be willing to pay. And if we want Russia to pay, then we have to think about the mechanism. And the mechanism there can only entail gas, because remember, we have embargoed Russian coal and Russian oil, and Russian coal and Russian oil are now moved east. And so therefore, we cannot control the amount of flows of commodities and the amount of flows of money that they are going through those transactions. So the only way for reconstructing Ukraine will be to have a little bit of Russian gas going into Europe and be paid as used to be the case many, many years ago. There was a program called Oil for Food, that we were dealing with Saddam Hussein, and so there could be something like this. And if we do this, then maybe there will be gas being used to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine. But again, I think policymakers in Brussels should be coherent. How do we want Russia to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine if we don't want some Russian gas flowing, little amount, but some Russian gas? And how do we use this Russian gas to green our economy? Again, closing nuclear and opening coal doesn't meet the basics of the narrative of getting greener. So I think those were my 2 comments.
Well, and to your point, neither does natural gas. So if you're going to have a net zero economy in truth, not the way that Google is accounting for moving electrons from Singapore to Iowa and back and forth to say they're net zero, that's not net zero. And I think people are starting to see through that. But in order to make Russia pay, Russia's going to have to lose. And does anyone see progress in the war makes it look like Russia's either going to stop or lose? And that's not even to say that, they are a nuclear power. At what point in a losing battle does Russia turn to nukes? Like, it's truly remarkable to me that we're pushing this proxy war against the Russians using every life that the Ukrainians have to offer, with no open discussion of peace talks, no understanding even really of what Russia's objectives are, and this view that Russia will lose. Well, the sanctions clearly haven't been working. The ruble's doing fine. Russian investments seem to be doing fine. So yeah, to the rebuild of Ukraine, that implies the war ends. And I don't see it ending anytime soon, and certainly not the way the West would expect it to end.
Ralph, did you have something to add?
Yeah. This is again very interesting topics. I would just add one quick thing about the net zero. In the basic situation is, once you start rebuilding Ukraine, you're gonna need steel, you're gonna need cement, you're gonna need plastic, and none of these things can be produced with net zero. So this is going to be a huge, and I hope it's going to happen. I wish them to prosper as a society and as a country. And as David pointed out, unfortunately, nobody knows when the war is going to be over. But once it happened, I really hope that reconstruction consumption is going to happen quickly, but you cannot rebuild a country with zero emissions. I think and I think everybody, of course, I'm just stating the obvious. Everybody knows this. Construction without emissions is impossible. And I have to repeat, if you forgive me what I said before, the world at the moment we are rolling the dice on climate change. And I think we saw it during the COVID pandemic. I mean, if you look at the numbers of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, it wasn't even a dent. So closing down significant parts of the global economy, it was barely measurable statistically. So again, as Thierry said, net zero is a political talking point. It's part of every document, of every conversation, but I don't see it. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, right? And this is just a pessimistic outlook, but I think this is just not going to happen. The need for energy, the need for construction, the need for the basics of industrialized societies will always have emissions. And as a last point on this, also with EVs, I mean, this is so unfair. The lifetime reduction in emissions when you compare an EV with a regular car, at least according to Mark Mills, is about 15%. So we act as if we would replace all the cars in the world with EVs. It's not that we would kind of reduce emissions from traffic from 100 to 0. We would reduce it by 15%, so it would still be 75% of the original value. So a lot of the proposals are simply too optimistic, and we just push the emissions back. I mean, Tracy, you wrote and talked about this a lot. So okay, fine. So the emission is not going to come from the internal combustion engine, but it's going to come from the huge excavators and all the huge technology that we need to get all these resources out of the ground to build the batteries and to build the EVs. So we just push the emissions further up the production chain, but they're still going to happen one way or another.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to drive like, I think it's 50,000 miles to try and get to anywhere close to offsetting the carbon emissions of actually building and mining, from ground zero up from the supply chain on up to building an electric vehicle, including mining and everything. And not to mention manufacturing, which also takes energy. We'll take 2 more questions. So Peter, you had a question, and then we'll take global.
Yeah, I mean, I would push back against what was said by DRW a little bit. The Chinese have come out already and said that, they're going to try and push for a peace deal. I mean, I don't believe in Chinese genuine, but they follow a policy of benevolent neutrality. But, I think what I want to follow up on is the EU has, absolutely accelerated its decoupling from Russian reliance, at least from a pipeline scenario, and they want to try and do that by 2027. So Putin's goal to try and capitulate the Europeans into adhering to their demands has done the opposite. Yes, you've got alternative markets, but equally Russia's not having an easy time. I mean, my own family in parts of Russia are telling me that the country's in a pretty dire way in certain areas. So I do think we should keep that in mind. Sure, they're ostracized and you're seeing a greater split. But the other question I just want to, hammer home on is this, is the alternatives then, right? So if there's such an emphasis on on renewables, which ones are most viable, and equally which countries can fill that void, right? We've got quite a seismic shift in the Middle East with the rebalancing of power, the Iranian, Saudi Arabian, and so on. Do you think anyone on the panel that is a viable alternative for the Europeans, or is it just a case of we're going to see a bit of a deficit at the moment because it's difficult to find the solid alternatives?
Anyone want to take that? Ralph, Thierry? No one?
I agree with everything that Peter said. I think this, the alternatives. That's a good question. This is, at least I talked to a couple of engineers and technicians, and my hope is that in certain areas of the energy industry that maybe that's putting on the optimist hat for a change, that at least nuclear energy in Germany might be saved, right? That there is a turnaround. I mean, I would say, and again, I don't mean this as a cynic, but if unexpectedly a peace deal, a ceasefire, anything of that nature should be agreed upon. I think that Europe would, or at least let me rephrase this, some European countries would jump right back into their energy relations with Russia, maybe at a lower level, at a lower degree. But I still believe that in some countries, politicians fear their own voters more than they fear Vladimir Putin. And any politician who could write on their resume, their political resume, brought down energy prices, that's probably worth more than ostracizing Putin. And the reason why I'm saying this is because this is what happened after 2014. Right, there was some finger wagging at Putin regarding Crimea, but at the end of the day, the energy relationship was continued. Just one last quick point. Don't forget, even Nord Stream 1 was commissioned in 2011, at a time when it was at least somewhat clear that Putin's intention towards some countries are not the best. And then, of course, we had Nord Stream 2 in 2022. So I'm afraid that a normalization with Russia, unfortunately, in many ways, probably would happen much sooner than some realize. But again, it's one of the things I hope I'm wrong at, but it's at least something we might have to consider if a surprise peace or ceasefire should take place.
Thank you.
And perhaps I would add on the energy production or worldwide level. I think, again, the European Commission needs to become literate in energy and geopolitics. I mean, thinking that we are going to produce green hydrogen in Africa, bring this green hydrogen in Europe, and then produce green steel in Europe to ship the green steel to build Africa, when you know that you cannot ship hydrogen, but you can easily ship steel, makes absolutely no sense. So I think we also have to have a view of the world that's not, I would say, neocolonialism, and to say, well, yes, Africa has some opportunities as a very sunny region. I mean, the south of Europe also. And I think that could create, by the way, if I look at it, some kind of tension in Europe, because you're seeing tension between the south and the north, because Greece, Portugal, Spain, for example, are willing to have a different electricity market, because they now understand that they can harness the solar electricity at way cheaper levels than Germany. So I think we have to become more or less dogmatic and to understand how energy works and how geopolitics works, and we are far from here.
Absolutely. And then Global, did you have a question?
I have some comments that I've written down here, if I may. First of all, I'd like to thank the last speaker who spoke about energy. Clearly, energy policy is very, very different across the Eurozone. And thank you for highlighting that the North and the South have two very distinct competitive advantages and disadvantages, which I think needs to be addressed within the Eurozone, because they're not all the same. I want to make three short comments.
There's no question in there?
Well, there will be a question. Absolutely. There's a question for sure. There is a question. This is clearly, there's been much discussion around, I guess it was a prior gentleman also spoke about the reapproachment with Russia over energy. And I think that is very much realistic and will need to happen if Europe, especially Germany, the heartland of Europe, the industrial heartland, wants to continue to have some sort of competitive advantage as it relates to energy. And quite frankly, it is no different than the Biden administration looking to entertain Venezuelan oil over, I guess, the course of 2022. So I don't know why people would view that as being any different. This is about national strategic interests. This certainly isn't anything else. Here's my points. Somebody mentioned Ukraine. Just as an FYI, my family has been in the steel business since 1958, well aware of Ukraine. All of Europe have set up plants throughout all of Europe over that period. I know the steel business inside out, backwards and forwards. And let me tell you, the nonsense that I've heard with regards to somehow we're going to power steel somehow through some sort of a green initiative is absolutely incredibly nonsensical. It should just be evaporated from from any discussion. It makes zero sense. Met coal is the key driver, whether we like it or not. Unless we can drive some sort of new means in order to create steel production, it's not going to happen any other way. And I certainly would entertain anything, but it's not in the cards, at least not in 2023. The other thing I wanted to mention, Ukraine, which I've had exposure to, has been largely uninvestable in a pre-war scenario. My question is, what would make anyone believe that somehow in a post-war environment that Ukraine all of a sudden would become some sort of a utopia for investment? And if so, who is set to gain from this? And I guess the question that I have is, will it be the Ukrainian people, or of course, will it be the foreign investors? And if so, what complement of foreign investors would participate, and would they exclude Russian investment in Ukraine? Because as we know, you can't just pretend that the Russians are going to just sit back and not participate. And again, this is a personal point in the pillaging of Ukraine, because quite frankly, that's what we have here. So there's some questions there. And the second piece, which is very, very important, and I truly believe that the notion of a Russian defeat is, again, also nonsensical, because it goes back to the existence. You have to assume that the Russian state as it sits today will be reduced to something very, very different than what it presently has. So my question is, if you accept Russian demise over Ukraine, that you must surely accept that the escalation of war will become much worse, with which both statements, unfortunately, cannot be true. So the question is, can you get a Russian defeat without any escalation? And if so, what does that look like in this process? Because one of these is definitely not going to be true. And the notion that people believe that somehow that Russia will be reduced to nothing, or will accept defeat and allow NATO expansion sitting literally in front of them, which would be the longest border in front of the Russian Federation, is truly remarkable if that would occur. So there's a bunch of questions there that I think would probably garner some interest. Thank you so much for allowing me to say a few words.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we know BlackRock is, right? Because they just announced it. So they're going in there. But Ralph, you want to take this?
Yeah, just a couple of points. Thank you so much for these comments. I think they are thought provoking, and in many ways I agree. I just want to comment on the last one. I leave the other ones to somebody else, and maybe say something myself that's a little bit provocative. But the Russian Federation is not Milosevic, Serbia, or Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So the idea that you can, as the previous speaker said, that you can kind of forever kind of isolate them or something. I think they're too big. They're in energy and agriculture too important. This is not going to work. So despite, and I condemn the invasion. I condemn the human rights violations, the war crimes as much as anybody in this round. But there needs to be a way back in one way or another for cooperation between the West and Russia. I know this sounds horrible at the moment, but if you allow me kind of one personal note, I come from a family that lost many, many members on my grandfather's and grandmother's side with the war with the Soviet Union. And one is surprised how quickly relationships between the Soviet Union and Germany, both East and West, have been reestablished. So in the European experience, this is not something that hasn't happened before. But yes, I think that the talk about victory and Russian demise and the breaking up of the Russian Federation is more driven by emotions than by sober and maybe some would cynical geopolitical analysis. And also on the larger scale, it's not in the West's interest to have Russia as a permanent partner of China. So I think this is a reality we have to face. And just as Nixon and Kissinger broke out China of the communist bloc, I think at some point, maybe, again, I'm just speculating, and again, I know this might sound horrible at the point in time when one says this, that we have to think about breaking Russia out of their relation with China. I know, as I said, I mean, this is. I'm not trying to defend Russia. I'm not trying to make light of crimes. Not at all. But I think we have to face the fact that a country of that size, a country at the moment with its economic heft, has to be dealt with, and they cannot be treated, like Gaddafi or Milosevic or Hussein. So I think it is true that a new approach, a different one, will be necessary.
I think those are great comments. Peter, last comment, and then I'm going to do my last round with everybody, and because we're going well over an hour. So did you have something?
Yeah, very quickly.
One thing you want
I mean, no, I don't want to. It's not. I'm not part of the panel, but this is my wheelhouse. Look, I have Russian heritage. My grandmother actually comes from the Donbass as well, so I have direct affiliation with the main area of this conflict that, has been going on since 2014, right? What I would say is there's a reason that Russia was not added to the state-sponsored terrorist list, because the complications to do that when it came to Iran were sizable next to, say, North Korea or Syria. To do that with the Russians, I mean, there's a few factors here. I'm not, and I think people must understand, and I'm not saying anyone in here doesn't, but when people talk about things, we've got to remain objective in the sense of when we're playing war simulations, it's not what we want to happen, it's what we think could happen. There's a huge distinction here, and I've been ridiculed because I have this heritage and people think I want Ukraine to lose. No, I'm just simply acknowledging the fact that the Chinese are now going to Ukraine to potentially negotiate with the Ukrainians over a ceasefire and potentially more. The press secretary just came out and said there's some degree of alignment between Ukrainian and Chinese peace resolutions, which is interesting, but also vague. So point is, Ukraine is in a very difficult situation, and it's simply unrealistic to think that Russia will collapse immediately. Now, Russia's one of its biggest problems, it's purely its geography, demography-wise, infrastructure, all these things hamper its ability to be a well-developed economy and a balanced one. So, that's a whole separate conversation. But global, to your point, very simply, I think it's incredibly difficult to talk about the time frame going from here, because at the moment neither side wants to give up. The Russians are just much more of a sizable force, maybe not capable, and it determines heavily on the propensity for the West to continue to support the Ukrainians. And so when you're talking about it, to bring it back to the topic of the conversation about energy, it goes to whether or not, comments like what Macron was saying a couple of weeks ago, which were ironically tacitly supported by much of Europe, that there needs to be a decrease of reliance on the US, but also not being so reliant on the Chinese or the Russians for big markets and cheap energy and all of this. And that's going to put Europe in a difficult position, I think, going forward, as they try to, facilitate renewable methods, but equally not become, see their prosperity flatlined. So it's a difficult one, and I think the war is a huge component to that in the short to medium term.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. All right, so we're going to do the last round, and the last round we'll start with Terry. Really, what you can either talk about something that you think is important that we haven't discussed yet, or what should we really be keeping an eye on, particularly as investors, as far as energy policy is concerned, over the next, 2 to 5 years?
Well, I think what we have to look at is what's going to happen next winter at the European level, because if we don't face a mild winter and if reality kicks in this time, then they will have to understand that the theory and the narrative of the Green Deal is facing some huge hiccups, and there will be some realignment with reality. And this realignment with reality can come in two ways. It can come at wake up at the European Commission, but it also can come up with, that we have election in 2024 for the new European Parliament, and the new European Parliament might be less pro-European, which will create more problem in the energy side. So I think we are for a tough ride here, unless we try to adjust to reality as fast as possible. And I don't think, unfortunately, that Vladimir Putin in Russia will help us. So he will throw stuff at us at the European Union to make us the situation worse in the coming winter.
Thank you. And Ralph, your final words, either something that we haven't discussed yet, or what should we really be focusing on, over the next couple of years or so?
Well, one of the things, and we touched on it a little bit, is there has never been a great power or great civilization with a dysfunctional bureaucracy. So it doesn't matter whether it was China or whether it was the US after the implementation of the Pendleton Act, or the famous French bureaucracy, or the Prussian bureaucracy under Frederick the Great. It always comes back to the best ideas or the best plans need the necessary tools to execute them, and very often that's bureaucracy. So I think we need to talk about the quality of governance, the quality of states, the selection process, both in civil and public service and in politics. Sometimes this seems like a facetious topic, because we very often believe that there is this dominance of economics that politicians only can react to it. It's a very Marxist view in a certain way, that everything is defined by economics and we are just puppets on the string of the production forces. But I think this is going to be a bigger topic. If we do not get better personnel in politics and public service, I think we have a real problem.
Thank you. And David, who just fell out, try to get him back really quick for his final words.
That's me.
Are you back?
Yeah, I am.
So
I am back.
your final word, something that either we should be paying close attention to over the next couple of years, or something that we haven't talked about that you wanted to touch upon.
Yeah, I mean, so I would absolutely echo, we need better people in politics, but also who's crazy enough to go into politics today. And the fact that the DNC, as we know, is basically saying there will be no debates during the primaries for Biden is insane. The fact that Trump seems to be the heir apparent when, I mean, quite frankly, he failed and certainly would mobilize the Democrats to lose. We need better people in politics. What I have seen, though, is the way that people are crawfishing back from the COVID views they shared 3 years ago, when it was absolutely definitively the worst thing ever. And now it's not. I think you're going to see that on climate change, net zero, because the reality is, and I'll quote Bjorn Lomborg on this, it's going to cost each and every American $11,400 per person per year until 2050 for us to accomplish net zero, which is roughly $1.2 million after tax per family of four in just cost, EVs, higher prices, etc. And that's from a Nature study. Once consumers start feeling that, politicians will very, very quickly move from net zero is the greatest thing in the world, very similar to the way they moved from COVID is an existential threat and we must shut everything down, to we're basically where we were in 2020, except we have massive inflation and a whole bunch of unhappy people. So something has to give. I don't know what will be the one, but you can start seeing it. So I will be on the edge of my seat waiting for nothing to change.
Well, thank you. All right. I want to thank the panel today, Ralph, Thierry, and David. Follow these guys on Twitter. They post lots of good information. And again, thank you to my guests for taking time out of your day to be on the panel today. There was a lot of great information. I'm sure everybody got a lot out of it. I know I did. And I will see you guys next Wednesday on Wednesday Spaces. Thank you again.